Hello everyone and welcome to a very nice game from the second round of the online FIDE World Corporate Championship. This is the first edition of such an event, and if you also have a company and you have employees, then you are more than welcome to enroll them for the second year, which could be a good idea. And this is a clash between the Sberbank trade union and the Kindred group that Carlsen is a part of, and it's Anton Korobov versus Magnus Carlsen. But the teams cannot have like all the players to be grandmasters. Only one player can be rated over 2500. In the case of this team, it's Magnus and Korobov, and every team must have one woman player on the team. So let's check it out. This is a clash from board one, and I still haven't seen any of the other games. I didn't even think such names like Magnus and Anton Korobov would be playing, but it seems that a lot of very strong players are playing. So we're going to cover a few games. And as the title suggests, this one features a most impressive position. So without further ado, let's check it out. Korobov with the white pieces opens with d4. We have d5 by Magnus, c4. We have e6, knight to c3, and c6 going for the semi-Slav. We have e3 and knight to f6. So both players just continuing to develop pieces. Knight to f3, knight b to d7, and now queen to c2. We have bishop to d6 preparing to castle, and there is one game in the database where b3 was played, but here in the game we have bishop to d3, and it is as of move 7 that we have a completely new game. So let's see how the game continued. Both players castle, we have castles, and now d captures on c4. We have bishop captures, and now queen to e7, developing the queen. And now black still needs to develop the light square bishop and connect rooks with a3. Of course, the bishop will get under attack, so you need a square to retrieve it. a6 now, adding additional support for b5 because you also want to play c5 next. So rook to d1, and now comes b5, attacking Korobov's bishop back to a2, and now the immediate c5. And black solved all of his problems now. He strikes in the center with c5, bishop to b7 is coming, the rooks are probably coming to c8 and d8, and black's development will be complete. So d captures on c5, bishop captures, and now knight to e4, going after Carlsen's bishop on c5, and Magnus decides to trade knight for bishop if Anton seems it's favorable for him. So bishop to b7, developing the light square bishop on this diagonal, and now Korobov captures on c5. We have captures, and the queen to e2 now. The rook is probably coming to c8, so you don't want your queen here on the c file. We have knight f to e4, getting the knight deeper into the position, and now knight to d4, centralizing the knight, but also leaving your control of the g5 square. So now Korobov can easily get his queen over there. So first he pushes e5, kicks the knight back, and now knight to f5 with an attack on the queen, but also queen to g5. Now attacking the knight, and also if this knight moves, then you could be getting checkmated here, as both the bishop and the queen are eyeing the g2 square. And I don't think if I've mentioned, but this is a rapid game. Both players have 10 minutes on the clock, and they get a 2-second increment for each move. So getting both threats out of the way, so just knight back to g3, now blocking, and here comes rook a to d8. So nicely developing the rooks. We have bishop to d2. Of course, you don't want to trade here because then would have control of the d file. So first the bishop to d2. Now you can move the bishop, and then both of your rooks will be able to either get to the d file or whatever white decides. So here knight captures on d2, grabbing that bishop, rook captures, and now again knight to e4, attacking the rook and the knight here. And it's a problem. If you go for something like knight captures and bishop captures, yes, mate is being threatened, and it seems like f3 solves all of your problems, but just bishop captures on f3, and now you have some serious problems. Because even though you can capture with the queen, the rook will be hanging here, and not the way to go. So before deciding on that, first Korobov decides to grab the rook. We have rook captures on d8, rook captures, and now rook to c1, preparing rook to c7. And now Magnus abandons the attack and has to go back to defend the 7th rank. So knight captures on g3, h captures, and queen to e7. Now guarding the c7 square. We have b4. Now you no longer have this annoying b2 pawn, and your bishop is now excellently placed here. G6 by Magnus, and now rook to c5, preparing to put more pressure on the central pawn. Queen to d6, and now we have bishop to b3. We have queen to d3, offering a queen trade. You cannot play queen d1 now, but you can play queen to d3. And this is where Anton decides to trade. It seems like it's favorable for Magnus, because it seems like queen captures on d3 is the only move, because the bishop is hanging, but not really. Here, Korobov plays bishop captures on f7. And it does make sense. If the king captures, then just rook to c7 check. But there is nothing better. So king captures on f7 is played, and rook to c7 check now. And of course, you cannot block check, because just queen captures queen, and the rook is pinned. You cannot capture the queen; it's just lost. So after rook c7 check, king back to g8 by Magnus, and now we have a trade. Captures, captures, and of course captures. And now Korobov is up a pawn, but Magnus grabs the a3 pawn, and now the material is completely equal. So rook to a7, not allowing the black rook to move, as this pawn would fall, and h5 now. We have king to h2, and now comes rook to a4, putting pressure on this pawn. We have f3 by Anton, and now e4. Magnus either wants to get this pawn to be extended to f4, or he wants to trade, or he wants Korobov to capture here. Korobov decides to capture. We have f captures on e4, and now rook captures on b4. We have rook captures on a6, and now king to f7. And it seems like it's a completely drawish endgame, and in fact it is, but Korobov is up a pawn, and Carlsen's king is a bit more active. So let's see how the game continues. We have rook to b6, putting the rook behind the passed pawn. You should always do this. And g5 now by Magnus. We have e5, and now rook to b3, putting pressure on the e3 pawn, but you never want to allow white to capture the b5 pawn. So e6 with check, king to e7, and now we have e4. We have g4 by Magnus, cutting off the king, so the king will now have to go all the way around to reach the game, and that's exactly what Korobov does. We have king g1, and now rook to b2, cutting the king off from accessing the second rank. King to f1, and now rook to b4. Sorry, not rook to b4, b4. Magnus starts pushing the passed pawn. King back to g1, and now b3 by Magnus. We have king to h2. Again, Korobov has to wait and see what Magnus will do, and now rook to b1. And here is a very interesting, it's a very interesting position, because now you can see that the king has no moves. If there were no white pieces on the board, it'd be just stalemate. And Korobov could in fact go and try achieve such a thing. For example, if Korobov plays e5, let's say b2. Now, yes, it's very scary. The pawn is already on b2, but just rook b7 check, and good luck escaping checks now, because after you capture this pawn, rook b6 check, you capture this pawn, and now just rook e6 check. If black captures the rook, it's stalemate. The white king has no moves. The pawn covers the h3 square, and the rook the entire back rank. So here you'd have to move, but the white rook will happily just continue checking you. Rook e4 check. If king d3, just the rook e3 check. King to c2, not a problem. Rook c3 check, and so on. King d1, rook d3 check, and whenever the black king captures, it's going to be a stalemate. So this is not a bad moment for Korobov to claim the draw, but Korobov decides to play rook to b5. He's still fighting for more than a draw, it would seem, but also it could be that they are just both extremely low on time, as they were. So here, king to d6 by Magnus, king captures on e6 by Magnus, and now rook captures on h5 by Anton. But now it seems like Korobov tried a little bit too much, because this position is in fact winning for Magnus, but it's not an easy move to find. So feel free to pause the video here, even print screen it or something like that, and study it for a week, for a month, and then come back to this video and see if you got it right. But if you just want to enjoy the show, that's also possible. So really, pause the video and try to find the winning idea for Magnus while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on spotting the brilliant king to d6. king to d6 is the only move for black here. The problem is if you play something like b2, then white just puts the rook behind the passed pawn, and that's it. There's not much you can do here. And white is threatening, for example, after this pawn reaches the b2 square, black is threatening after the pawn reaches the b2 square, just rook h1 check, king captures, and then you promote to a queen. But white will never allow this. White will just put a rook behind the passed pawn, and that's it. And that's where king to d6 comes in, as it wins so much tempi. For example, now rook to b5. This is best for white, putting the rook behind the passed pawn. Now king c6, and already you came from here to here, while the white king is still stuck here on h2. Rook to b8, getting the rook out of the way. Now you play king to c5, and now you want to get your king down the board and advance the passed pawn to victory. But it all comes down to one move. With e5, king to c4, now e6, white also has a very impressive passed pawn, and now comes rook to e1. The king is now also defending this pawn, and now white needs to guard this pawn. First, white of course will throw in some checks. Rook to c8 check, king to d3, rook to d8 check, let's say king to c2, rook to c8 check, rook to c8 check, king to b1, and now that the king finally finds safety here, you're gonna have to go back. Rook to e8 to defend this pawn, and now we use the simple art of triangulation to get to this exact same position, but that it's gonna be white's move. So we're gonna play king a2, and after one more check, let's say rook a8 check, king b2. Again, the pawn is hanging, so the white rook has to defend it, and now only one, we play king to b1, and we get the exact same position, but now it's white's move, and now white doesn't really have a good move. If you play e7, then of course this is just winning for us. We're gonna play b2, and that's it. The white king has no moves. You're gonna have to move the rook somewhere, and wherever you move the rook, we just eliminate this pawn, and then it's winning for us because we have a passed pawn on b2. So that's what would happen if you push the pawn. But if you don't push the pawn, you can play something like rook to g8, try and maybe grab some of these pawns, just b2. It's not a problem. If rook captures, we're just going to play king to c2, prepare to queen our pawn. And if rook to b4, getting the rook behind the passed pawn, we're just going to queen our pawn, and that's it. Captures, we capture this guy here once it's our move, and then it's just a completely winning endgame for black. So not an easy move to find, and like I said, both of them had only a few seconds on the clock, so they couldn't calculate all this way, but Magnus did not go for king to d6. Magnus in fact played rook to c1, for who I don't know why, but Korobov of course immediately just played rook to b5. He put the rook behind the passed pawn, and now it's not no longer possible for the pawn to be pushed. We have rook to c3 by Magnus, king to g1, we have king to d6, and now king to f2, bringing the rook into the game, king to c6, attacking the rook, and just rook to b8. Of course, Korobov will remain with his rook on the b file. We have king to c5, and now e5. The pawn starts marching forward. We have king to d5, attacking the pawn, and now just rook to b5 check, king to e6, and now king to e2, trying to bring the king closer to the pawns here. We have rook captures on g3, and now king back to f2, rook back to c3, and now king back to e2. Korobov now very happy with the repetition. We have king to f5 by Magnus, now again king f2. We have rook to c2 check, king to g3, and now b2. Magnus now gets a nice pawn here on b2, and now e6 with check, getting the black king away from the defense of the g4 pawn. So king captures, and now we have king captures on g4, and now king to d6. Also possible is just rook captures on g2. Also possible is a rook captures on g2, and after king to f3, rook back to c2, and then king to e4. Also possible because the black king is now completely cut off from reaching the passed pawn, and white will simply not be able to, black will not be able to queen the pawn. So instead, after king captures on g4, we have king to d6 by Magnus, and now king f3. We have king to c6, attacking the rook, and just rook b8. Korobov remains on the b file. King to c5, and now g4. Now the g pawn starts marching forward. King to c4, we have king to f4, king to c3, and now g5. We have rook to d2 by Magnus, trying to cut off the white's rook attack towards the b pawn, but now king f5. We have rook to d4, and now only one move saves Korobov from losing the game, and I'm sure you all know what it is, but just in case, feel free to pause the video and don't lose this game for Korobov while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on grabbing that pawn. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, it's of course rook captures on b2. This is what Korobov played, and then of course Magnus had to capture, and now the passed pawn is marching forward, and Magnus will have to give up his rook for that pawn. Rook to d1 was played, g7, now rook to g1, going after the pawn, now just king f6. We have king c3, king f7, preparing g8, and now after king to d4, we have g8, promoting to a queen, and here Korobov captures, and it was in this position that the game was drawn due to insufficient material. So really wild stuff. It was a pretty equal game all around, but then Korobov at that moment decided not to go for that e5 move, and he allowed Magnus to seize victory, but with little time on the clock, it was impossible to do it. But that's why you guys paused the video and found the victory for Magnus. Magnus' team lost 3.5 to half. Only Magnus got a draw, and all the other teammates on his team lost. So great victory for the Sberbank team, 3.5 to half. And yeah, we're gonna check out on some of the other games from this event, as it seems like there are much more strong players than I even thought there would be. That's the game. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I would like to thank Thought Dreams, Scott Christensen, Vitvareka, Gerald Ladd, and Earth to the Book for a contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon. Continuing the coverage of the Morphy saga, checking up on your wonderful suggestions, and whatever else happens in the chess world, such as this very nice event here. So thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.